So the most creative of all of the titles that I managed to come up with in the entire series, commuting in your PJs, um, coping with the new normal of work from home. So basically in all of our presentations so far, we've started out with a basic terminology just so that we have a common ground to start from. Um, and it was pretty interesting the number of different kinds of definitions that I found for work from home. But a generalization of all the ones that I read is what you see here. It's basically when any employee works from their place of residence rather than going to some kind of a corporate property. Um, Hybrid work gets mentioned an awful lot in here, so that's a combination of working from home and at a company property. Just so that we also clear this up from the start, is a lot of times you'll hear work from home and remote work being used interchangeably. And if I do that here, um, uh, just bear with me a little bit. I'll try not to, but they're not the same thing. So all work from home is remote work, but not all remote work is work from home. There's an entire industry of remote work where they are all remote workers, but they all sit in an office and work in places all over the world. So just keep in mind that for this particular presentation, we're referencing work from home specifically. So if I say remote work, just know that what I'm trying to get at is the work from home concept. And then there's also another term that gets used in some of the charts that I have a little bit further down, is this idea of remote capable roles. So there are obviously a lot of jobs out there that are far more remote capable than other jobs. So when we talk about remote capable roles in this presentation, those are any roles that can be performed completely or nearly completely from any internet connected location. So we'll start with some of the work from home adoption rates and where they were, where they peaked during the COVID transition, and kind of where they're at now. So in the first two blocks here, we've got this total workforce idea. So in 2019, the total workforce before the pandemic was running somewhere around 5.7%. And that number was about 4% in 2010. So the adoption rate for that decade was, I guess we could say, extraordinarily slow. So less than 2% addition over the course of almost a decade. Between the end of 2019 and the end of 2021, that number tripled, slightly more than tripled, to 17.9%. With these peak numbers in the next two charts, the peak work from home was in May of 2020, and that was running at somewhere just under 35%. And then those during that same time frame, the peak for actual remote capable roles was somewhere around 70%. And these peak numbers certainly give you an idea of that knee-jerk panic reaction that an awful lot of us were trying to deal with at the beginning of the pandemic. So those numbers have settled down a lot since 2020, and now in 2022 we've got these next two blocks where you've got the hybrid work from home right now is running around 52%, and they're saying by the end of 2022 that'll be somewhere around 55%. And the fully work from home is actually declining, and right now it's somewhere at around 20%, and will probably be close to that by the towards the end of 2022 as well. And the biggest factors for work from home availability, are pretty common knowledge. The role certainly has an awful lot to do with it. and the most remote capable roles, just a handful of them. This list goes on and on and on for sure, but customer service, customer support, sales, accounting, management, the finance sector. So roles have a lot to do with it, and kind of what I was alluding to before. It's really hard to do plumbing or construction as a work from home job. So role is definitely the driving factor for the work from home. And then location actually has an awful lot to do with it. Um, I'm not sure what to do with this particular data, but the 5 areas of the country that have the highest per capita work from home population include Rhode Island, the District of Columbia, Delaware, North Dakota, and Maine. And the bottom 5 are Hawaii, Alaska, Texas, Florida, and Colorado. Here's a big pretty chart from a Gallup poll that kind of just visualizes all the stuff that we were just talking about. So your green is exclusively remote, blue is the hybrid, and the pink is your on-site only. And you can see that the on-site is increasing gradually. The exclusively remote is continuing to decline, and hybrid is certainly becoming the new normal. According to the Gallup poll that this came from, generally workers want to be in the office 2 to 3 days a week. That's what they consider to be hybrid. And that seems to be where an awful lot of organizations are sort of landing. And this hybrid concept, it really allows for allowing some level of face-to-face contact with your coworkers and your management team. And we know that face-to-face and having that time together in groups, it does help drive innovation, and it does help solidify a lot of sense of teamwork. But the hybrid also allows an awful lot of workers to have some of that extra autonomy that goes with work from home, which over the last couple of years we've learned has become an incredibly important benefit that workers have come to rely on during the work from home days. The other thing is that the hybrid concept seems to allay an awful lot of fears that management and ownership seem to have about the productivity of their workers, as well as just being able to successfully manage their workers. So hybrid is certainly going to be the beast that we have to deal with. So work from home has been around an awful lot longer than the pandemic. As we talked about, going all the way back to 2010, we had a 4% work from home force. So why was work from home such a big shock to the system when the pandemic hit? And for today's presentation, we're going to break it down into these 4 categories: security, infrastructure, communications, and culture. So COVID forced an awful lot of businesses to make what seemed to be a decision they were dragging their feet on, to accept that work from home had to be a viable solution. And the pandemic dictated that, because they didn't really have much choice. If they tried not to do work from home, they simply weren't going to be able to do business. So work from home was kind of forced at this point. And so we know that from a security perspective, most companies and even the workers really weren't ready for that fast of a transition to work from home. A lot of workers found themselves untrained and unsupervised and disconnected from any support system that they had at the office, and they really struggled with that. Um, and uh, the infrastructure we discovered, an awful lot of infrastructure was really not in place to have a really successful transition to work from home. That resistance that management and ownership seemed to have led to this lack of investment in a remote capable workforce for a really long time. So when we had to do this really fast transition, the stuff wasn't there to be able to make a clean transition over to a work from home environment. And that is, one of the easy evidences of that is like VPNs. VPNs are generally run from the firewall level in corporate environments, and what we've been able to see as an MSSP is there were an awful lot of companies that the firewall firmware hadn't been updated, so they were telling people to go download the VPN clients, but they had a newer version of the VPN client than the VPN server on the firewall, and they wouldn't connect. And so then they had to do a bunch of firmware updates on firewalls. And that led to an awful lot of brokenness to this transition to work from home. And then one of the other things that we specifically came across was there were companies who had firewalls in place that in order to save money on their firewalls, they didn't have VPN licensing for those firewalls. So they have these firewalls that are supposed to be VPN capable, and they're trying to get people to connect to them, but they didn't have the right licensing in place to be allowed to have those connections. And then one of the other ones that we ran into were internal networks that weren't they didn't have the proper configuration in their routing and their segmentation to allow the VPNs access to the resources that people needed to be able to get to. So there were lots of those kinds of infrastructure issues that we came across. The communication side of thing, we know that something like 80% of communication is nonverbal. Human to human communication is like nonverbal. And digital communication leaves this really big void in how we communicate with each other. The really real world example that I have of that one, and I will speak for myself for sure, is the number of times that I've sent an email or a text or an instant message that the person received it in a very, very different way than I intended. And when we miss out on a lot of these nonverbal communications, that leads to misunderstandings that maybe or even probably would not have happened in a face-to-face setting. One of the other things that we'll talk about in the communication section is we also ran into this really, really dramatic explosion of different platforms that we were suddenly expected to communicate with others on. In the days of going to the office 5 days a week, it was pretty straightforward. You used email, or you picked up the phone and you dialed someone's extension, or you walked to their office. And now all of a sudden we're using Teams, and we're using Slack, and we're using email, and we're using text messaging, and we're using whatever other platforms that people and organizations were using for these kinds of communications. And then, the last part is this culture concept. And a lot of this is born out of how there was so much resistance for so long to the concept of work from home that there wasn't any real investment in training people or implementing the right infrastructure. And all of this culture stuff and this lack of investment, this lack of training, led to these really gigantic gaps in policies that left both employees and management confused and frustrated when they were trying to figure out how to do work from home on the fly. So if we look at that first category of the security, so what are some of the security challenges? You see the list of vulnerabilities and you can see the list of risks, and we'll run through these, and hopefully after this we can maybe have ideas that I can add to this. But the biggest security vulnerabilities that came to mind for me when I was doing this presentation, putting this together, the accessing of the corporate resources on unsafe networks. The number of times that the number of organizations that just told people, here's a laptop, here's a VPN, connect to this and you'll be able to get to the work resources. But then these people go to public Wi-Fi, they go to the coffee shop, they go to the library, they go wherever, and they jump on public networks to access corporate data. And yes, that's what VPNs are intended for, but only when they're configured properly is that going to be a nearly bulletproof solution. So this idea of letting people connect to the corporate network from public places certainly puts corporate resources and data at risk. One of the big ones was the use of personal devices. A lot of companies didn't have enough laptops to hand out to people to be able to connect back on company-owned laptops. And the issue that you run into there is when users have their personal devices, they have admin rights on those. And a lot of people were really reluctant and flat out unwilling to adhere to basic security structures that would normally be in place inside a corporate environment or inside corporately owned devices. An add-on to the first one up there, working in public spaces, never underestimate the good old-fashioned shoulder surfing attack. The number of hacks that I've seen that started from somebody working in a public space and an attacker just sitting there with their phone pointed at them, recording everything that they're doing on their screen, and then they just take it back and reverse engineer what they saw happening on that screen so that they could develop a really strategic attack for that particular company. And that, the use of personal devices and people working from home and having a lot more quote unquote freedom than they would have inside an office environment, it really starts to blur the lines of professional and personal limits. Things like music streaming was one that came up an awful lot when I was doing this research. The number of people who would stream music in an office environment is much, much lower than the number of people who would stream music at home. And attaching to these external services while they're over the VPN has, multiple kinds of risks. One is that is a potential attack vector for attackers to get into their personal device and then ride the VPN over into the corporate stuff. And then even really simple things like if you have 100 people on the VPN and they're all streaming music and it's all running through the VPN, that increases the amount of bandwidth that's necessary for the VPN. File sharing. We're all in remote locations now, so when we want to share information with each other, we have to do these file shares. And a lot of file sharing was kind of left up to the end users to figure it out. And that led to, we have seen in our own experience with working with some of our clients that they'll have a plethora of file sharing platforms that they're using, and that when you have all of these different ways of doing that, that's just increases the number of potential attack vectors, and it also increases confusion. You end up with data in a lot of different places, and the people who are supposed to be responsible for protecting that data may or may not know where all of that stuff is. Attacks on VPNs. The number of attacks on VPNs increased pretty dramatically over the last 2.5 or 3 years. And there's a slide a little bit further down that has some some pretty interesting numbers on that one. And then the communication scams kind of comes along with that whole idea of, with all of these additional platforms that we use to communicate with each other, it becomes easier to spoof end users when there are so many different ways to communicate with someone. The Uber attack that came up not too long ago was somebody pretended they got into the Slack channel and they pretended to be the IT department and managed to IM someone and got information that they then used to gain access to the corporate network. And having all of these different ways to communicate with each other, when we were in an office and there was email and you would pick up the phone and dial an extension and talk to someone, if you suddenly got an email from somebody that said, hey, I need you to go buy all of these gift cards, in the classic way, people fell for that. But not nearly as much as when you can get hit from 5 different directions. You can get a Slack message, you can get an instant message in Teams, you can get an email. It makes it easier to bombard somebody with communications and confuse them when there are multiple ways to do that. So the infrastructure challenge, this one boils down to 4 pretty basic things. Out-of-date, unpatched network equipment. The number of devices that we have seen that are in use that are already end of life hardware devices, whether it be firewalls or switches or load balancers or whatever, they may already be out of date. They may not actually be under support anymore, so they can't even get updates. And a lot of that equipment is kind of invisible to the end users, and the only people who know about it are the IT folks who have to deal with it all the time. Let's face it, an awful lot of times IT comes and says, hey, we have these switches that are getting close to end of life, and we need $50,000 to replace all these switches. And accounting says, well, let's talk about it next quarter or next year. And the real danger that we fall into there is, as long as it works, it must be fine. But just because it's working doesn't necessarily mean that it's properly secure, properly patched, and able to be kept up to date. We talked about the VPN stuff, and that kind of also comes back on this infrastructure. So we know that VPNs are more relied on now than they were pre-pandemic, and we also know that there are an awful lot of end users that just don't understand how a VPN works and why they need to have it. We have clients that use VPNs for stuff, and we fairly regularly, and this isn't intended to be derogatory in any way. It's just that the number of times that we get somebody who says, hey, I'm working from home today and I can't access the server folders. And we say, are you connected to the VPN? And they're like, oh, I forgot. They just don't understand that their connection to the office is completely dependent on that VPN actually running. And we need to make sure that we try to help them to understand what a VPN is, and they don't have to understand all of the ins and outs of what makes a VPN work, but they need to understand why it has to be in place. And a lot of that boils down to, if you just tell somebody, hey, you have to do this, they will probably remember it sooner or later. But if you tell somebody, hey, in order to accomplish what you want to do, here are the steps that you have to take, and they understand why those steps have to happen, they may be more likely to remember it. Out-of-date and unpatched computers. We can certainly attest to, and I know that there's a tech on the call here who will shake his head fairly maniacally, the number of companies that went to that closet that had all of those old machines and drug out all of the old laptops and fired those things up and handed them out like Tic Tacs and said, here's your new work from home device, go home with it. And, those things were, decommissioned and taken off the domains, that lots of things happened. And then they had been in a closet for months, and then they sent people home with them to start working with them. And it keeps popping up. The user gets it home, they fire it up, and it pops up and says, hey, Windows has to do all these updates. And they say, not now, not now, not now. And a lot of these unpatched computers also led to a lot of weaknesses that were abused, especially early on in the pandemic. And then the non-company owned computers, we talked about that one in the security thing as well. Personal computers means that you are almost guaranteed to start allowing non-compliant devices onto your corporate network. The idea that you're going to get a home user to allow your IT department to make their home computer compliant for your network is kind of unrealistic, and it's very unlikely to happen. So the communication challenge we talked about in a couple of different ways. This reliance on digital communication and losing that face-to-face interaction, it basically puts the end users in a place where they have to start accepting and believing that the digital communications that they're receiving are accurate and on purpose. So the social engineering bad guys out there have certainly learned that lesson and have done their best to maximize their attacks that take advantage of that willingness to accept digital communications now. And all of this leads to this higher susceptibility, and one of the biggest ones that's out there right now is the business email compromise. The fact that we have to use these remote ways to interact with each other, the social engineering attackers out there have gotten really, really good at abusing and weaponizing that entire platform so that they can get people to click on the links or go to the websites or download the attachment or do any of the different things that they do. And then the culture challenge. So we also have somebody on here who is a big policy person, and they'll appreciate this entire slide. So we have, and I put this in a present tense because there's still an awful lot of this that's happening, but it really came to light in early 2020 when we suddenly had to really drive this work from home solution, where we had so many things that were undefined and unclear about the work from home experiment. And this is a management and ownership. I shouldn't say it as a problem. This is something that falls to the management and ownership to work with their workers to develop these kinds of policies and procedures so that this stuff doesn't happen. So we have this, all of these undefined roles. We had an awful lot of folks, especially early on, that didn't know if their role was even work from home eligible. Could it be a work from home thing? We had people who were declared as necessary workers that may or may not have necessarily been necessary. That's a lot of necessaries in one sentence. But we didn't have in place a policy that stated these positions, these roles, these departments are work from home eligible and these are not, which led to an awful lot of people who wanted to be able to work from home and they were told no, and a lot of people who had no idea that they were going to be work from home who were suddenly sent home with a laptop and told, congratulations, you're now work from home. The next one is really huge. This unclear expectations of what work from home is supposed to look like. There needs to be a written set of guidelines for what work from home is supposed to look like. And though that should include the expectations of both the workers and management. So, some of the things that need to be covered there are what is the availability of the worker, the production requirements, proper communication channels. The worker availability is, okay, are you still an 8 to 5? I know that there were some employers who said that since these people were doing work from home and they didn't have to commute, that they should probably work from 7:30 to 5:30 since they didn't have to commute. They should work that time that they would normally have been commuting. And they expected that of their workers, but never told them, and then held them accountable for that kind of stuff. And we have to make sure that everybody is on the same page on these expectations. The production requirements should be pretty clear. The proper communication channels. This is one that goes back to a couple of the slides that we've already talked about. But if you have 4 or 5 different platforms that you use to communicate with folks, there should be some limitations on those. For instance, all financial communications will be done by email only, or by phone call only, or whatever. So that way, that if you work in accounting and you suddenly get a Slack or a Teams chat from your quote unquote CFO that says, hey, we need to add this person to this accounting or to this account at the bank, right away that didn't come via email, which is the proper communication channel for this. So this is probably spoofed and I need to get the IT team involved. So limiting the kinds of the ways that communications are done, especially on sensitive and critical communication stuff, will go a long way to helping protect both the end users and the corporation. The undefined acceptable tools, a lot of folks who are having to use their personal devices for work from home, they have applications on there that would not be allowed on a corporate device, but they have them on their computer. And if that's the one that they like, they may very well use that one to do work items. And this can lead to all kinds of weirdness, from compatibility issues with other workers to, hey, as it turns out, they're using a cracked version of some Microsoft product that is adding malware to every single save that they are now sharing with all of the coworkers. And then the last one is kind of the uh-oh moment, and this should be in place, work from home or not, but undefined incident response plans. Users were generally unclear what they were supposed to do if they thought something bad had happened to their computer. When they were in the office, they would just either pick up the phone and dial the extension for IT, or they would just take their laptop in and hand it to them and say, something weird is going on. But now they may or may not know who to contact. What's the right way to get a hold of IT? What is okay to send in an email, and what should be relegated to phone calls only? These are all decisions that we are facing now, that we're in this work from home environment, that we simply didn't do anything about prior. So, how do we secure the technology? I wish that there was something really interesting to put here, but it's all the usual stuff. Patching, and making sure that you're using current and supported hardware and software. That is still going to be one of the biggest attack vectors that is going to continue to be used against us. Keep informed on the latest VPN exploits. And this kind of goes back to those VPN attacks that we were talking about. In 2019, the number of CVEs, which stands for Common Vulnerability and Exploits, it's a list of known attacks or known vulnerabilities that are being used in the wild, that's kept by MITRE.org. The number of CVEs against VPNs specifically in 2019 was 67. And the years prior to that, they actually were considerably less than that. They were running generally in the 40s. And if you go back into like 2015, there were like 27 or something like that. But 2019, there were 67. In 2020, there were 99. So that's a full 30% increase. And then you're looking in 2021, there were 87, and 2022, we're on track for another high 80s. We're at just shy of 60 right now, and we have a couple of months left to go. So we can see that the number of vulnerabilities that are being discovered against VPNs are certainly on the rise and are staying at an increased rate. So it's really important that your IT teams and your IT security should be aware of those things and be able to make sure that they keep up with patches on the firewalls and on the VPN clients. Use company-owned devices whenever possible. This one's pretty straightforward. Asking end users to adhere to strict company security policies on their personal devices has never gone well. And it's unlikely that that's suddenly going to change. And then do what we can to limit the number of platforms that are being used. The more different platforms for communication, the more different platforms for collaboration, the more different platforms that are used, the easier it is for an attacker to hide in the noise. So fewer platforms, less complexity, fewer attack vectors. And then how do we secure our people? This starts with that culture idea. Documentation of all of the policies, both for workers and for management. This lays out a very clear definition of expectations and what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. It gives guidelines and guide rails for everybody to abide by, which is going to increase productivity and decrease security risks. Make sure that we're limiting all of our critical communications to a single platform. Train users and help them to understand why things are the way that they are. Trust is really, really critical in this work from home environment. And that goes both ways in that the workers, management has to trust their workers, and the workers need to trust their managers. And just dictating to people that you have to do this way because I said so doesn't do anything to build that trust. And that comes down to, these bottom three down here. Make sure that we're talking to our end users. Talk to them about what they're seeing as a security concern or a productivity concern. They're going to help us to make better policies and to make better technology decisions. Compromise whenever we can, but make sure that we stand firm and try to offer an explanation when we can't compromise on something. And then the last one is make sure that your support staff, first off, make sure that you have a properly staffed support staff, and make sure that they're approachable and that all of your end users are comfortable using their services. We, as an MSSP, spend a fair chunk of time talking to our clientele, and they'll call us and say, hey, we got a question about this email and sorry to bother you about this. And we're like, no, this isn't a bother. If you ask me about an email that looks suspicious, that is going to take a lot less time than to deal with than if you just click on things and now I have to go clean up a mess. So, we thank them for those kinds of calls, and we, appreciate that they're looking out for the safety of the company. So, work from home is here to stay. So where does that leave us? And it kind of comes down to the good old fashioned, pay me now or pay me later. We can either invest now in proper solutions or we can pay for it later. Work from home, especially in that hybrid context, it's the new normal. This is the way that the next foreseeable generations are going to work. For an awful lot of us, the good old days of going into the office 5 days a week are a thing of the past. They just, those days are unlikely to come back for an awful lot of us. And so with all that in mind, we can either try to continue to improve the situation or to just, wash our hands of the whole thing and let it spin wildly out of control. Work from home can absolutely be done well, but it takes an awful lot of effort and energy from all of the parties involved, from the managers who have to maintain the productivity and to continue to manage their folks from afar, to the workers who have to provide that work. And everybody has to do their part, and those parts need to be clearly defined. Make sure that we're investing in our security and the technology for sure, but make sure, just as importantly, that we're investing in our people. Make sure that we're listening to their concerns and answer their questions when we can. I have said this as an MSSP for a really, really long time, and this isn't specific to work from home, but man, is it surely in the spotlight right now. But a diligent and informed workforce is probably the greatest security tool that any company has. So, and that goes for the workers, management, executives, and owners alike. So, as part of that, where does it leave us? A couple of calls to action that I think would be interesting tabletop exercises for anyone out there. If you're in a position of management, or if you have management's ear, ask the IT team for a detailed asset inventory with both software and firmware versions, along with end of life for those items. Get an idea of how old your infrastructure really is, what needs to be updated, what needs money, what needs time. Those are going to be things that, if you already have infrastructure that is out of date or nearly out of date, this work from home thing isn't going away. So we need to make sure that we are investing in those things so that we can continue to support a safe work from home environment. Talk to HR and ask them, what are our policies on work from home? And this, again, whether you're in management or if you're a worker who's in work from home, ask for the work from home policies. See if there are any. Read them and see if they make sense. And then the last one that I have is try talking to somebody from a different area of the company than where you are. So if you're a worker, talk to somebody in management. If you're in management, talk to somebody in IT. Ask them about how work from home has affected their day-to-day work. And if they aren't doing work from home, if they aren't actually working from home, ask them how others working from home has affected their day-to-day routine. The more that we understand about how work from home is affecting each other, the better we can write those policies and the better decisions we can make, both from the securing our technology as well as the securing our people perspective.